Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for August 12th, 2022. And on this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about George Mason's warnings on power and consolidation, centralization of power. I'm going to highlight some of the stuff he talked about and did in the Philadelphia Convention and then shortly after, and then also at the Virginia ratifying convention the following summer. There's plenty of stuff that's been ignored for far too long. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I should mention, if you want to follow along with the stuff that I'm mentioning, the links, the articles, the original source documents that I'm mentioning in this episode, you just got to find us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. That's the show homepage where you're going to find all the archives of the show. And for each episode, I publish an individual blog post that includes a bunch of different platforms we're on, both audio and video, and in the show links section, all the things that I mentioned so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And let's start out with a quick overview from Bob Ruppert with an article over at the Journal of the American Revolution, All Things Liberty. Here he's reviewing the book, The Founding Father Who Gave Us the Bill of Rights. And he said, this is just some of the highlights of why George Mason was such an important founding father. And Bob writes, he was either the author or co-author of several important documents: the Virginia Non-Importation Resolution of 1769, the Fairfax Resolves of 1774, the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776, the Virginia Constitution of 1776, part of the federal Constitution, the Constitution for the United States, and the objections to the Constitution of Government formed by the Convention in 1787. And Bob points out that the Virginia Declaration of Rights became the primary influence on Thomas Jefferson when he drafted the Declaration of Independence and was central to all his future writings and convictions. Now, in the Philadelphia Convention, by the end of August, so as they're getting close to the end, George Mason was pretty concerned that the battle for liberty was actually getting lost in a conflict, a debate between two different factions. On the one side, people who wanted legislative dominance, and on the other side, people who wanted executive dominance. And here, R. Carter Pittman writes that he began to draft proposed alterations, handing them to anyone he thought might use them in that raging conflict, ostensibly so that, quote, the system would be unexceptionable. One proposal, Carter writes, was that, quote, the object of ye national government to be expressly defined instead of indefinite powers under an arbitrary construction of general clauses. Now, the great concern here, if you read this, is about arbitrary power. This is one of the grievances specifically listed in the Declaration of Independence. Basically, arbitrary power is unrestrained power, or power based on the whims of people who hold that power. There's no specific limits on that power. I covered that in an episode just a couple of months ago, Arbitrary Government, How the Founders Defined Tyranny. This was the definition of despotism, basically a government that could change the rules and exercise what power it wanted to on a whim. And George Mason was concerned that at least at that stage of the Philadelphia Convention, that there were terms that could be defined by people in power that would give them basically arbitrary power or despotic, tyrannical power. I'm going to link to that show note, that other episode in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And his concern, of course, like many others, especially on the anti-federalist side, and even Thomas Jefferson, when he was originally looking at Benjamin Franklin's first proposal for the Articles of Confederation some years earlier, he specifically was concerned about using the term general welfare, for example. And Mason here was very concerned about using terms in a constitution that weren't strictly defined, because then if you do, you shouldn't be surprised when that power would grow and grow and grow. And here's one of his great quotes. He said, "Those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. On the contrary, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it. Not they will sometimes or most of the time or once in a while, but Mason warned that power by its very nature will always seek to expand. Anyways, back to the Philadelphia Convention. Here, another article by Bob Ruppert over at All Things Liberty. He said, before September 12th, 1787, Mason was actually able to get the Committee of Style to insert the words "herein granted" into Article 1 of the Constitution so that Congress should be expressly limited to the powers defined in the Constitution. With Congress limited now for the first time, he proposed his Bill of Rights on the afternoon of September 12th. George Mason, like many others, Patrick Henry and others, were very much opposed to the Constitution and in their terms as it now stands. That was the phrase that was generally used by anti-federalists, opponents of ratification, ratifying as it now stands. Patrick Henry specifically, and Mason as well in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, they were concerned about the idea of ratify now, amend later, because they were really worried like, well, even if we make a deal and we think these people are honorable, let's think about human nature. Can we really trust that this will happen? They didn't like that idea, but he proposed a Bill of Rights on that afternoon of September 12th, 1787. We know that the Philadelphia Convention was all done by September 17th, so this is really near the end. He certainly got voted down. And there's some other things that he did in the Philadelphia Convention. For example, on August 17th, here in Eliot's Debates, the notes, Mr. Mason was against giving the power of war to the executive because not safely to be trusted with it. Again, too few people with too much power was a great concern. So centralization, power, and human nature were things that George Mason was very much concerned about. He was also concerned about giving the power of war to the Senate because it was not so constructed as to be entitled to it. He was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. He preferred to use the word declare rather than make, and they actually included that in the final text of the document. And then on September 15th, you may be familiar with me talking about Benjamin Franklin on the 17th, the last day of the convention, where he's calling for unanimous support, pointing out that there's a lot of parts that he doesn't like, but he just recognizes that you can't count on a constitution itself. It really is up to the people. And he expected that over time, the people would become depraved and things would end in despotism. 2 days earlier, George Mason, who did not sign, had a very similar view. And here from the notes, he seconded and followed Mr. Randolph in animadversion, so concerns on the dangerous power and structure of the government, concluding that it would either end in monarchy or a tyrannical aristocracy, which he was in doubt, but one or another he was sure. So he was looking at the structure of things unamended, and he felt absolutely for sure that it was going to end either in a monarchy or a tyrannical aristocracy. And in many ways, we have a little bit of both, even with those amendments that many of which Colonel Mason actually wanted. Now, in September, George Mason actually wrote out his objections to the proposed federal constitution probably just after the Philadelphia Convention convened. And his number one thing was that there was no Declaration of Rights. We know he tried Richard Henry Lee, even in the Confederation Congress before it was sent to the states. He also tried to get a Bill of Rights added. George Mason tried to get it added in Philadelphia. And then he and Patrick Henry and others wanted to see amendments added before they ratified. And here, the number one thing that he put in his objections was there is no Declaration of Rights, and the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws and constitutions of the several states. This is the Supremacy Clause. The declarations of rights in the separate states are no security. So you can have declarations of rights in your own state constitution, but if federal law is supreme, and then you're in trouble, right? He said, nor are the people secured even in the enjoyment of the benefits of the common law. And then he talks a little bit about the necessary and proper clause. He said, under their own construction of the general clause at the end of the enumerated powers, The Congress may, and he lists a few things, may grant monopolies in trade and commerce, constitute new crimes. Wow, so many things, so many criminal laws that they've created that they were never authorized to do, that George Mason warned us they may have a pretty endless list of them. He said they may inflict unusual and severe punishments and extend their powers as far as they shall think proper. So he was concerned, and I'm not sure if Mason was actually rejecting the original legal meaning of the doctrine of principles and incidents, which is behind necessary and proper. Many of the anti-federalists would say, look, we hear what Mr. Wilson is saying about the legal meaning of this phrase, but we don't trust humans down the line to follow it that way. We know that when people have a chance to expand their power, they're going to read legal phrases in ways that will allow them to do it and allow them to get away with that. So he's recognizing here, at least George Mason, and I'm not sure what was going through his mind, but he's specifically saying they're going to extend their powers as far as they shall think proper, so that the state legislatures have no security for their powers now presumed to remain to them, or the people for their rights. And he wrapped that one up with, this government will set out, and this is again the same message that he had in Philadelphia, this government will set out a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will, in its operation, produce a monarchy or a corrupt, tyrannical aristocracy. It will probably vibrate some years between the two and then terminate in the one or the other. Here from Mike Meharry in an article that we just published this morning. He said in a speech during the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he's referencing his speech of June 4th, 1788, George Mason said a consolidated government, and that was a term that the founding generation used for centralizing all powers into one, basically. He said a consolidated government is totally subversive of every principle which has hitherto governed us. So the idea of centralizing power was subversive to the principles of the revolution. The reason that they're even there talking about this document, this idea of centralizing or consolidating power, was totally opposite. He later added that consolidation is, quote, one of the worst curses that can possibly befall a nation. Today, we live under the largest, most powerful government in the history of the globe. And if that is not one of the worst curses that can possibly befall a nation, I think I'm going to go with George Mason on that one anyways. Just seems right. Here again to Meharry's article, he said, as Mason explained to the delegates attending the Virginia Ratifying Convention, the country is simply too big, and mind you, it was much smaller at the time, too big to have all its matters directed by a handful of politicians in a faraway place. Jefferson, who was not an anti-federalist, said basically the same thing. So many people said that same thing. Mason really held the line. He said, is it supposed that one national government will suit so extensive a country, embracing so many climates and containing inhabitants so very different in manners, habits, and customs? This is what I've said for so many years. The idea of decentralization, federalism, as the 10th Amendment requires under the Constitution, as the people are supposed to keep things in line but haven't, this is the only system where you can have such a massive country, a wide range of people with such a wide range of political, economic, religious, and social viewpoints, all living together under a big defense umbrella in peace. But that's really... Mason was far more eloquent than I am on that. He goes on, he says, it is ascertained by history that there never was a government over a very extensive country without destroying the liberties of the people. Then in another speech on June 11th, 1788, he said, I hope that a government, he's one of the original 10th Amendment supporters, he said, I hope that a government may be framed which may suit us, by drawing the line between the general and state governments. That's what the 10th Amendment, the 9th Amendment is all about, and prevent that dangerous clashing of interest and power which must, as it now stands, terminate in the destruction of one or the other. And he said the liberty or misery of millions yet unborn are deeply concerned in our decision. Here he is on June 14th, again in Virginia Ratifying Convention. he's again pushing this idea of decentralization and what became the 10th Amendment. He said, we ask such amendments as will point out what powers are reserved to the state governments and clearly discriminate between them and those which are given to the general government so as to prevent future disputes and clashing of interests. And then he talks about necessary and proper again, I think. Oh, this is a little bit about general welfare. He said that Congress should have the power to provide for the general welfare of the Union, I grant. So he's okay with at least giving him that power. Jefferson, when he was talking about Franklin's draft or proposal for the Articles of Confederation, actually said, I don't even like having terms like general welfare that can be misconstrued. I don't remember seeing something specifically about the same phrase for the Constitution for the United States from Jefferson. But here Mason is saying, yeah, we want them to have that power, but I wish a clause in the Constitution with respect to all powers which are not granted, that they are retained by the states. Otherwise, the power of providing for the general welfare may be perverted to its destruction. And unfortunately, even with that amendment, on top of it, they are still perverted to its destruction because the people have allowed it to be that way, or in many cases, they've actually demanded it. And again, here's Mason, in my humble apprehension, unless there be some such clear and finite expression, this clause now under consideration will go to anything our rulers may think proper. Again, necessary and proper to people with power is necessary for what they want to do and proper for whatever they think is right. And he said, unless there be some express declaration that everything not given is retained, it will be carried to any power Congress may please. Doesn't that sound familiar? It sure does to me. And Mike, this is from Meharry's article one more time here that I think is really interesting, because supporters of the Constitution kept telling us, oh yeah, maybe you have some points about how these terms may be misread, but first of all, we'll explain to you the actual legal meaning of them. So we know that this is going to be in the record and this is how things are going to be. And then on top of it, we've got such great people here that the best of the best, well, they're going to rise to the top. And that's how Mike explained it. He said, during the ratification debates, supporters of the Constitution argued that public virtue and the confidence placed in those with power would mitigate the possibility of abuse. Now, I can take one side or the other against anti-federalists and federalists alike on a lot of things. This one, I think, is the most absurd from the federalist side. This is one that I can never find a way to be convinced that this was actually good thinking. Maybe it was short term. And that's what Dr. Franklin basically was saying. He said, look, this Constitution has many flaws. It's going to be well administered for a short period of time. And then over time, the people are going to demand despotism because that's all they could ever get. So even Franklin, who was in support, was basically saying, you can't count on people to do the right thing just because they're good people over time. Patrick Henry warned us repeatedly about trusting the fate of our liberty in the hands or the hopes of our rulers being good men, as he put it, without a consequent loss of liberty. Anyway, so the supporters of the Constitution were repeatedly talking about public virtue, confidence, the cream of the crop is going to rise to the top and it's going to be well administered. And Mike says we hear similar arguments from proponents of centralized authority today. They say as long as good people wield power, we will enjoy good outcomes. And Mason threw cold water on this notion. He understood that nobody can guarantee good people will control those power levers forever. And this is how Mason put it. This, like all other assemblies, will be composed of some bad and some good men. And considering the natural lust of power so inherent in man, I fear the thirst of power will prevail to oppress the people. And I think George Mason certainly feared right. I hope you found this an interesting episode. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. If you support this work that we're doing and you want to help us get this information out to more people, nothing helps us get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great day. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.